In this lesson, we'll learn how we can render our photographic environments inside of 3ds Max. Alright, so in our previous lesson, we learned how we could set up a viewport background, so that way we could actually start to match up our perspective and our angle from our background plate to our 3D objects. Now the thing to keep in mind is that whenever we create any kind of a viewport background, it's strictly applied to the viewport. This is actually not applied to the rendering itself. So if we actually want to render this background, let's go into the rendering menu and take a look at the environment. Alright, so in some of our renders, this blue environment that we currently have, this is where we're actually controlling this. So again, if I were to press Shift Q on my keyboard to render this out, you can see here's that same blue color. Now, instead of that blue color that we have picked out here, let's instead use a map. And now in our environment map, let's go in here and we'll plug in a bitmap. There we are. So let's double click on the bitmap and now choose our desert image. Press OK. And now let's render this out again. Alright, excellent. And now we can actually start to see this environment being rendered out. Now, before we progress much further, there is actually a very, very important thing that I want to point out to you. So let me go ahead and just close this out, and I'm going to press the P key on my keyboard to switch back to a perspective view. Right, I'll press the Z key on my keyboard so we can actually zoom around here. And what I want to try to do is get these engines to a little bit more of a sideways view here. Alright, so something like that should work out. And what I'm trying to do is get these aligned a little bit better to some point in the environment to actually point out this little issue that we're going to run into. So let me re-render this again, pressing Shift Q on my keyboard. Alright, and now this is actually showing the issue that I wanted to point out. So in this particular scene, I have this engine material set up to be slightly reflective. Now what we can start to see is if you look at this engine, it actually looks as though it's a little bit transparent, where we can actually see this very definite line right in here. And we can start to see this a very clean break where we start to have this issue with where we have the sand, and then we start to see some of this shrubbery and other things that are back behind here. So again, if you follow this line, a very, very clean and definite line. So it might appear as though my engine is a little bit transparent, but that's really not the case. Instead, what this is actually doing is reflecting this environment around it. But because of the way that this environment is set up within this particular rendering menu, this is actually reflecting it in exactly the same angle as what the camera is viewing this environment. So what we get is this issue where we have these perfect reflections, and it just makes it appear as though we have transparency instead of reflection. Again, just because of the way the environment's bouncing off of the surface. So let's fix that up. Let's go into the material editor. Just press the M key on my keyboard. Alright, and now let's take this environment. Let's take this map and click and drag this into my material editor. We'll just drag this in as an instance. Now, if we're rendering with Mental Ray, which we are at this point, we can actually use a special connection of nodes to get ourselves a much, much better reflection in here. So let's scroll down, looking through some of the Mental Ray nodes, and let's drop in this environment background switcher. So let's click and drop this in. So what we can now start to do is choose a specific image that's visible in the background of our image, and we can actually specify a different image to be used as the reflections for our environment or anything that we have set up. So let's take this bitmap, and if we double click on this, you can see right now the mapping mode is set to screen, which essentially will just mean that that image is perfectly projected onto the screen, which is what we see here. So let's take this bitmap and let's duplicate this. Just Shift, click and drag on this bitmap. Let's double click on this, and now for this bitmap, I'm going to switch this from screen to something like a spherical environment. Now if you look close, you can see now where this image is no longer just a flat image that's going to be projected onto the screen. It should now be wrapped spherically around this environment. So let's take our screen image, we'll plug this into the background, and now we'll take this spherical environment map and plug this into the environment reflections. Alright, so now if you've happened to close out that window, let's now go back to the environment. Now take this and connect it back up into the environment map. So take our output, drag up into the environment. We'll connect that as an instance. And now, whenever we render this out, there we are, and you can see that is now much, much better. So we still have this environment that's being projected onto the screen itself to serve as our basic backdrop. But now in the reflections of our objects, we're now using this completely different spherical mapped image, so that way we can start to get much more natural reflections. And you notice that issue of what appeared to be a transparency earlier, we no longer really have that concern anymore. Alright, so that's a look at how we can now start to take some of our photographic environments and begin matching these up a little bit better and actually start to render these out. So now if I were to press the C key on my keyboard to go back to my camera view and render this out, you can now start to see some really, really nice effects here where, again, we now have this nice photographic environment being projected onto the background. But in these areas where we're now starting to deal with reflections, you can start to see in this area right here where we start to get this downward curvature, we're actually now starting to see some reflections of the ground reflected now in different portions of this Podracer's engines. And also we can start to see up in these top areas where we're starting to see some reflections of the sky in here as well, just as we should. Alright, so in our next lesson we're going to start incorporating some other lights and shadows into this render.